The inevitable betrayal. People are going to betray you. That's not an assumption. It's not a warning. It's a law like gravity. You don't have to believe it for it to be true. You just have to be alive long enough to witness it. And the sooner you accept it, the sooner you'll stop living like a victim in a world that was never built on fairness. Do you want to know why? Because human beings are not designed for loyalty. They're designed for survival. And no, this isn't the childish kind of selfishness you see when someone won't share their dessert. This is older, darker. It's instinctual. It's the kind of selfishness that's been burned into our neural architecture for thousands of years. One that says, protect yourself first. Everyone else is optional. You think betrayal is the exception, that it only happens when something breaks. But here's the truth Nietzsche understood. And most people are too afraid to say betrayal is the norm. Loyalty is the miracle. We live in denial of this because we want to believe in stories, in love, in honor, in forever. But all those things are just the polished surface of a much deeper instinct. Civilization itself is a mask, a carefully applied layer of makeup hiding the wild, ancient animal underneath. And that animal, it still has teeth, sharp ones. Have you been betrayed? Good. Welcome to the human condition. Are you waiting for an explanation? Emotional, spiritual, even logical. You won't find it. Because betrayal doesn't come from logic. It doesn't come from reason. It comes from fear, from desire, from the silent, primal need to choose self-preservation over promises. That's the part no one wants to admit. People don't betray you because you did something wrong. They betray you because, in that moment, it benefited them to do so. And that's all. No grand conspiracy. No divine lesson. Just entropy. The natural breakdown of trust in a world wired for advantage. Loyalty is temporary. Interest is eternal. And here's the cruel twist. Most betrayals don't even come from malice. They come from calculation. You stopped being useful. Someone else offered more. Or the fear of losing outweighed their respect for you. It wasn't personal. It was structural, built into the foundation of how the human psyche works, justified afterward by whatever story helps them sleep at night. Once you see betrayal as the default setting, the illusion of safety dies. And that's when the first cut isn't theirs. It's reality carving through your last comfort. The logic of betrayal, it was never about you. Let's make one thing clear. They didn't betray you because you failed. They didn't turn their back on you because you did something wrong. They betrayed you because at that moment it served them to do so. It was useful. It was easy. And most importantly, it cost them less than staying loyal. That's the part most people never want to hear, because it shatters the illusion that relationships operate on morality. The truth is, most betrayals don't stem from hatred. They stem from calculation. They're not driven by cruelty. They're driven by convenience. You think loyalty is the default and betrayal the disruption. But Nietzsche saw it differently. In a world built on survival, he understood the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. What he meant was this: we are constantly balancing two forces, our need for connection and our instinct to protect ourselves at all costs. And when those two forces collide, self-preservation always wins. People betray not because they're evil, but because they are human. And being human means being wired to prioritize our own interests. Even when they smile, even when they say they love you, even when they promise they never will. And when the moment comes, when staying loyal would mean losing something they crave, they choose what benefits them. Not because they hate you, but because in their inner cost-benefit analysis, you became a liability. And here's the psychological sting. They'll still tell themselves they're good people, because the human mind is a master of rationalization. We don't just lie to others, we lie to ourselves, because guilt is too heavy. So we tell ourselves stories that make betrayal look justified. They forced me into it. I didn't have a choice. I had to do what was best for me. And they believe it, not just to sleep at night, but to preserve the image of themselves as the good one. This is subconscious selfishness, the kind that doesn't even realize it's betraying. It doesn't announce itself with malice. It simply acts in its own interest, then builds a story around the act to protect the ego. This is why betrayal often feels so surreal. You're unraveling. They're rewriting the script, because in their mind, they didn't betray you. They adapted at your expense. They adjusted the narrative, not the guilt. And the most brutal part, they don't even see it as betrayal. They see it as survival. That's the true logic behind betrayal. It's not about right or wrong. It's about risk versus reward. You stopped being valuable. Someone else offered more. Or the discomfort of staying loyal outweighed the benefit of keeping their word. And in that split second, your entire history with them, your trust, your sacrifices, your shared moments, they were all placed on a mental scale, and they didn't weigh enough. That's not personal. It's structural. It's how the brain is wired. Humans are deeply strategic, even when they don't realize it. And most decisions, especially the painful ones, are made unconsciously, not out of evil, but out of a deep-rooted impulse to protect self-interest, avoid discomfort, and gain advantage. That's what makes betrayal so dangerous. It doesn't need planning. It doesn't require malice. It just needs opportunity and the absence of real consequences. And when it happens, you're left with more than pain. You're left with a devastating revelation. You were never as important to them as they were to you. And worse, they probably never intended to be. But betrayal isn't just about them. What makes it truly devastating is what it destroys inside you. Not just your trust in others, but the very image you held of yourself. When betrayal breaks the mirror identity crisis, here's the part most people never talk about. Betrayal doesn't just hurt because of what you lost. It hurts because of what it reveals. It forces you to confront the most unsettling question of all. Was I ever seeing things clearly? Because betrayal isn't just a severed bond. It's a shattered mirror. A once clear reflection now fractured, distorted. And you're no longer sure what you're looking at. Them you. The truth. You start doubting your memory, your intuition, your ability to judge. And it's not just that they lied. It's that you believed. You invested. You opened. You trusted. You weren't stupid. You were sincere. But now, sincerity feels like weakness. And that's how betrayal rewires you. You begin to internalize the wound. You don't just say, "They failed me." You start whispering to yourself, "I failed me." And that's where the true collapse begins. Not outside, but within. You begin to question, if I couldn't see this coming, what else am I blind to? What if I don't actually know who I can trust? What if I don't even know myself? This is where betrayal becomes existential. Not just emotional pain, but an identity fracture. You start to split the version of you who believed and the version of you who will never believe again. You don't just lose someone, you lose the person you were with them. You lose the narrative you built of being loyal, perceptive, safe, and in its place, doubt, paranoia, emotional paralysis. You tell yourself you're healing, but what you're really doing is retreating. You start holding back. With everyone, you become guarded, closed, silent. You tell people you're just focused, but what you really are is fractured, and that fracture echoes. You feel it in how you look at others, how you flinch when someone says, "Trust me," how you hesitate when someone shows you kindness, because now every gesture feels like a setup. Every promise feels temporary. Every closeness feels dangerous. And the worst part, you begin to adapt. You wear masks. You present versions of yourself that are less vulnerable, less open, less real. You think it's protection, but it's erosion. You're not building resilience. You're burying your essence. And this is where Nietzsche offers something brutal, but liberating. Amor fati. Love your fate. Not tolerate it. Not resent it. Love it. Why? Because the only way out of the identity crisis is through a radical act of acceptance. Not acceptance of what they did, but acceptance of what it awakened in you. The broken mirror isn't the end. It's the invitation to see yourself without illusion, without projection, without the borrowed beliefs you held just to feel secure. Because when betrayal strips you down to nothing, what's left is truth. And truth, though painful, is the foundation of power. And once you no longer trust yourself, the next betrayal isn't from others. It's the one you begin to commit against yourself. The betrayal you committed first against yourself. Here's the hardest truth of all. Before they betrayed you, you betrayed yourself. No one wants to admit that. But deep down you knew. Not everything, but enough. You saw the red flags. You felt the emotional distance. You noticed the inconsistency between words and actions. But you stayed. You silenced your instincts. You made excuses. You called it patience, empathy, love. But really, it was self-abandonment. You tolerated the unacceptable, not because you didn't know better, but because you were hoping they'd become better. This is what psychologists call an addiction to potential. When you fall in love, not with the person, but with the idea of who they could be, if only they changed. You weren't in a relationship with them. You were in a relationship with the future version of them you kept building in your mind. You told yourself, if I love them more, if I'm patient enough, if I just hold on, they'll finally see my value. But here's the brutal truth. You gave them all of you, hoping they'd eventually meet you halfway. You bent. You shrank. You gave. And in return, they took. Not always maliciously, but consistently. Until one day, you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize yourself. Your boundaries gone. Your standards compromised. Your intuition ignored. Your voice muted. You didn't just let them in. You gave them a key to the most sacred parts of you. And when they started rearranging your soul, you let them. Why? Because somewhere along the way, and you started believing the lie, that being loved required being less. You betrayed your needs to protect the illusion. You betrayed your values to avoid confrontation. You betrayed your dignity to delay abandonment. And perhaps the most devastating of all, you betrayed your truth to preserve a connection that wasn't even real anymore. You lent them your soul. They spent it, and you never even sent the bill. You thought that if you sacrificed enough, they'd realize your worth. But that's not how it works. Because someone who needs you to suffer to stay isn't loving you. They're consuming you. And that's what makes this type of betrayal so complex. It's not one wound. It's 1,000 small cuts, many of them self-inflicted. You weren't just betrayed. You were complicit. Not in their actions, but in the story you told yourself to justify staying. And now, here's the psychological consequence. Once you betray yourself long enough, you lose your ability to trust yourself at all. You hesitate. You second guess. You feel paralyzed in new relationships, not because of them, but because you no longer trust you to walk away when you should. And that's the internal fracture. No one sees. That's what lingers. Because when someone else betrays you, you get angry. But when you betray yourself, you go silent. And that silence becomes a cage. But here's the truth you need to hear. You don't need to shame yourself for caring. You need to wake up to how much it cost you. And more importantly, you need to take your soul back. You need to reclaim your voice, your intuition, your power to say, no more. This isn't about blame. It's about responsibility. The power to stop the bleeding is already in your hands. But only if you stop romanticizing the pain and start confronting the pattern. Because once you see it clearly, you realize something essential. You weren't asking too much. You were just asking the wrong person. And because you betrayed yourself first, you became more likely to forgive those who never deserved your mercy. But now it's time to look deeper. The silent betrayals, indifference, absence, and the illusion of care. Not all betrayals come with daggers. Some come in silence, in distance, in the quiet absence of those who should have stood beside you, but didn't. And that's the kind that wounds the deepest, because it doesn't bleed. It echoes. They didn't attack you. They didn't speak against you. They didn't actively harm you. They just weren't there. And that's what makes it so hard to name. You can't point to a betrayal. You can't replay a cruel conversation or a deliberate act. All you can feel is the void, the space where they should have been and chose not to be. It's not the blow that hurts most. It's the empty room. It's the phone that never buzzed. The silence, loud enough to scream, while your world turned to ash. Because betrayal isn't always a violent rupture. Sometimes, it's a slow vanishing, a quiet retreat, a presence that fades just when you need it the most. And it's in that absence that the deepest questions begin to surface. Did I ever matter to them? Were they ever truly here? This is what psychologists call passive betrayal. Not an act of aggression, but an act of neglect. Not stabbing you in the back, but standing by while someone else does. Neutrality, in moments of moral crisis, is not noble. It's complicity. When someone claims to love you, but refuses to take a stand, what they're saying is, your pain is not worth my discomfort. And that's betrayal in its most insidious form. Not because it attacks you, but because it invalidates you. They'll tell you they care. They'll say they're just staying out of the drama. They'll insist they didn't want to choose sides. But in doing nothing, They made their choice. Sometimes, the traitor isn't the one who strikes. It's the one who watches and does nothing. You expected loyalty. They gave you neutrality. And neutrality, in moments of crisis, is a quiet kind of violence. Because when you're under fire, and someone claims to love you, but won't shield you, you're not just left alone, you're exposed. And that's where the real fracture begins. Not just between you and them, but between you and your belief in connection itself. You start questioning the very fabric of relationships. You begin to see the world through a lens of suspicion, where care is conditional and presence is performative. The web of support you thought you had, it dissolves, and you're left with the sickening realization you were more alone than you ever knew. Because here's the truth, no one wants to admit, some people don't betray you with action. They betray you with absence, with apathy, with the illusion of care that evaporates the moment it becomes inconvenient. And worse, they'll still claim love, still call you a friend, still use the language of closeness, but from a distance so wide, it might as well be a lie. They love you, as long as it costs them nothing. They support you, as long as it doesn't threaten their comfort. This is the illusion of care. A shallow, convenient loyalty that disappears at the first sign of sacrifice. And that's what leaves the deepest scar. Not the betrayal itself, but the collapse of the story you believed. You thought they were different, that they wouldn't do this to you, that what you shared was stronger. But what you really had was an illusion. And in the face of that collapse, you don't just lose them, you lose something more sacred, your sense of safety in the world. And in that absence, what hurts most isn't the person who left, but the trust that dies with them. Because once you stop believing in the people around you, you start losing belief in everything. Betrayal is rebirth, the fire that burns illusion. There's a moment after betrayal, after the shock fades, after the silence settles, when something strange happens. You stop trying to fix it. You stop waiting for an apology that will never come. And in that silence, something inside you begins to crack, open. It doesn't feel like healing. It feels like fire. But that fire is doing something essential. It's burning away the illusion. Because betrayal isn't just an act. It's a revelation. It strips away the performance, the fantasy, the story you clung to, and leaves you face to face with what was always there. But you refuse to see. And that moment, when you stop trying to go back, when you stop hoping they'll return as someone new, is the moment you begin again. This is where rebirth begins. Not as some spiritual cliche, but as an internal reckoning. A death of illusion. A resurrection of self. Because here's the truth. You are not what they did to you. You are what you do with what they did. Pain isn't the enemy. Delusion is. Betrayal forces you to see who's real and who was never really there. It's the ultimate filter, the most brutal form of clarity. And if you can survive it without becoming bitter, without becoming like them, you become something unshakable. This is the alchemy of pain, a process where emotion is transmuted into wisdom, where anger is melted down and recast as discernment, where loss purifies your path, not because you wanted it, but because you needed it. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Betrayal gives you the chance to rediscover your why, to stop living through others, to stop outsourcing your value, to finally return to the center of your own life. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it feels like your soul is tearing apart. But maybe it needed to. Because sometimes the version of you that they betrayed was already too far from your truth. You don't just lose people in betrayal. You lose parts of yourself. That you no longer need the parts that tolerated too much. That silenced your voice to avoid conflict. That wore a mask to keep peace with people who only loved you when you were convenient. Betrayal is the fire. But fire doesn't just destroy. It forges. You were not meant to remain unchanged. You were meant to evolve, to strip away the layers that never belonged to you, to remember your boundaries, to reclaim your dignity, to stop begging for validation from those who cannot even validate themselves. You don't need revenge. You don't need closure. You don't need them to understand what they did. You need to understand what it did to you and what you will now do with it. Because from that pain, if you face it, study it, listen to it, a new voice will emerge. One that doesn't ask, why did they hurt me? But instead says, I will never abandon myself like that again. You'll stop chasing apologies. You'll stop explaining your worth. You'll stop lowering your flame to keep others comfortable. And you'll rise. Not because you were never broken, but because that's real. Power, quiet, cold, and carved from pain. No one saw but you. Not the kind that needs to be loud. Not the kind that needs revenge. But the kind that survived truth and kept its heart intact. And if you make it through this fire with your soul, still your own, then you're no longer the victim. You're the beginning of something unshakable. Because betrayal didn't destroy you. It revealed you. Leave. Rebuild. Never return the same. So here you are. Not the same person who pressed play. Not the same person who tolerated too much. Not the version of you who waited for apologies, chased closure, or begged to be understood. Because something inside you has shifted. Something that cannot be undone. Betrayal is not just an experience. It's a rite of fire. A ritual you never asked for, but were forced to walk through anyway. It burns. It breaks. It reduces you to ash. But it also reveals what's indestructible in you. That's what no one tells you. The fire wasn't your punishment. It was your initiation. Before betrayal, you lived, edited, tamed, accommodating. You believed in promises without reading the fine print. You assumed loyalty came from love. But now, you know better. Because real loyalty isn't about presence. It's not about who stays when it's easy. It's about who chooses you when it costs them. Who protects your name when you're not in the room. Who sees your rawness and doesn't run. And when you realize how rare that kind of loyalty is, you stop settling for the performative kind. You stop mistaking proximity for respect. You stop confusing attention with care. You begin to choose silence over small talk, solitude over shallow connection. You begin to rebuild, but this time differently. Not louder, not colder, just clearer. You begin to walk away without announcing it, without slamming the door, without explaining your worth one last time. Because those who need to be convinced of your value were never meant to sit at your table. Let them talk. Let them misremember. Let them create their version of the story that makes them feel like the hero. It no longer concerns you. Your silence is not weakness. It's clarity. Your absence is not revenge. It's self-respect. Because the most devastating thing you can do to someone who expected your dependence is to disappear without bitterness, to no longer be accessible, to no longer be available to the same cycles. Disappearing from where they betrayed you is the beginning of real power. And if you needed a sign, this is it. Your permission, your proof, your turning point. You don't owe anyone the unhealed version of yourself. You don't need to keep showing up where your spirit is unwelcome. Leave, rebuild, but never return the same. Because now you've seen the truth. You've seen what betrayal does not just to your heart, but to your mirror, to your boundaries, to your beliefs. But if you've come this far, you've already crossed the threshold. You didn't survive betrayal. You survived the version of you who let it happen. That you can burn and still rebuild. That you can walk through fire and come out made of something fire can't touch. So if this spoke to you, if it lit something inside you that had been quiet for far too long, don't just watch and move on. Mark the moment. Leave a comment with the words, "I am no longer the person I was when this video started." Let the world know. Let yourself know. This wasn't entertainment. It was a mirror, a ritual, a rebirth. You've outgrown the versions of you that needed their approval. You've outgrown the spaces that only knew how to drain you. And now, it's time. Not to prove anything to them, but to become everything you buried to be accepted. Welcome. Or better yet, welcome back to yourself.